start out with a digression. I get asked to consult on a lot of farms. It's pertinent to the idea of the most common complaint I have that I get called into a place. They want me to see everything. They want me to consult with them and they let me know they don't want to change. That, unfortunately, we laugh about it, but that seems to be a mindset. People want to be told how to keep doing what they're totally different. The bad news is we can get a very different result, but it's going to take. We need to look at farming as adding a good practice, not sound system, not going to change like lifting. We've got, my background is, my mother was a refugee before. Actually my grandmother who lived with us, was a young woman in Silesia when Rudolf Steiner gave his lectures, which is an interesting tie into history. I grew up hearing her talk about Steiner and Ehrenfried Pfeiffer, and everything Rodale ever published was in our house because of her influence. And sometimes you plant a seed that lays dormant for a long time. When I got out of high school and went to college, I went to the land grant system and learned how to farm correctly. And came home. My father was probably the most backward farmer in the world at that time, in my mind. It's amazing what he learned in a few years afterwards. But he let me try things, and that was good. So we had the Green Revolution on our farm overnight, and we saw yields go up. We saw some really good crops. My mother stepped in, though. Said, you're going to document everything you do, and you're going to prove it pays, or you're going to change. So we took very close observations on what was happening on our farm. And to fast forward a little bit, I've got to admit it was a little bit like a drug addiction. That the first time we used the extra nitrogen and more fertilizer, other things, we got a tremendous bang in terms of yield increase. The next time it took a little more input to get a little less output. And within a few years, it was taking so many inputs that our profits were gone. And it was really fortunate that I was required to keep this kind of records to actually know what was going on. And we had gotten to the point, and I don't know if a lot of you are probably old enough to remember this, but in the 70s, we were planting crops knowing we were going to lose money on them because we couldn't afford not to take that massive subsidy. The other thing we were doing was planting corn in a spot in the rotation where it was costing a lot more for inputs because we had no other alternatives. We knew that our farm would do better if we had more diversity on it. We knew that corn was always more profitable after a good legume plowdown. But selling some of these alternative crops was only marginally more profitable than dumping them in the ditch because there were no markets for it. We only had profitable markets for the program crops, and then only profitable when you factored in the program payments. So fast forward to when we started a family, and I split a partnership. I had two brothers that I had to buy out, and they ended up with more land between them than I had, so we only had 500 acres. And we realized we're not going to make a very good living at this if we keep doing it this way. The margins just weren't good enough. And one day my wife was reading the farm paper, and there was an ad in the back of it that said organic wheat wanted. And at that time they were paying $6 when the elevator was paying $2.50. And we kind of looked at it, and of course this is ridiculous, but at $6 we could lose a lot of yield and still be money ahead. And we did all the calculations of how much yield we could lose. And then when I contacted the guy, all of a sudden he said, well, do you have any soybeans? And do you grow any oats? And do you grow any rye? And do you grow any... And he kept asking about all these other things. Now here was someone actively wanting to buy stuff that I couldn't find a profitable market for in the past. And in doing this change, we were nervous. Think of a young couple with, we had 3 kids, and we really didn't know how to pay the bills. We could barely, there was that fear factor. You can just pay the bills, so making a change is scary because you don't know if it's going to come out. So we went to Cornell, and at that time, our extension specialist explained to us that, organic seems to work on a few little market gardens, but it's totally ridiculous to think about doing it on any kind of scale. It just won't be possible. And that was kind of all the encouragement I needed at that point. But we went back to Cornell, and we studied the Mann Library. And I knew that people had farmed without all these inputs in the past, and they were doing so fairly successfully in some areas. And I wanted to know why. And the first thing we discovered was in the more easily accessible part of the library, there were hardly any books written before 1940. So either people weren't reading books then, or they weren't interested in reading about farming. But then we went into the stacks, and we found some older books. And one professor in particular stood out that really challenged my thinking. This goes into thinking about a system. This was a man named Bernhard Ademacher. He was department head in Germany at his university until he was probably way past retirement age. They say he lived to be 95 years old, and his son occupied that position after he did. But what Ademacher wrote, and he was also the first guy to work on herbicides. He wrote, cultural practices form the basis of all weed control, while the various other means should be regarded as auxiliary only. Now that threw me, first of all, because I didn't know what cultural practices meant. And second, because here the guy that was doing this early work on herbicides was saying that this was not even the basic weed control. So I started studying, what did he mean? And obviously weeds were our biggest fear. Fertility was the second biggest fear. And what he meant was that all of these things that we do in a field before we grow the crop, even years before, have an impact on that environment in that soil. And the environment that we create is going to determine what species are best adapted to grow there. Now, I'm going to take on another diversion, and I realize we're in a different part of the country here than where I'm from. We're from the humid east. But what happens when you abandon a piece of farmland, something that's been in row crop production?
Goes to the trees.
Eventually it'll be trees, but the first year that you abandon that field, what do you see?
Bushes and grass.
Weeds. Don't you see, in New York you would see broadleaf weeds the first year. Things like pigweed, Palmer amaranth, lamb's quarter. They tell us that these weeds each make from 100 to 900,000 seeds. So we've got a piece of land that's covered with many orders of magnitude more seeds than what just came up. What happens the second year? Well, our reductionist way of thinking would tell us to expect more of the same, wouldn't it? Because we just seeded so much of it. But you won't see those species again. You might see a few of them. We're going to go to grasses. We start going to biennials, perennials. Something has changed. This group of plants that grew there the first year changed the soil. And they changed it in a way that made another group of plants be better adapted to be in that environment. If we let that happen in our farm, and went 500 years, we'd be back to a oak forest on the flatland, and we'd be maple on the gullies. I don't know, right here is probably prairie, or it was originally prairie. Here you would probably go to back to a tall grass prairie. But in between, we have this succession of species. And there's a term, and I think we can use it in time, but I see it in space very easily, the ecotone. The ecotone would be the boundary between two systems. So the ecotone of the ocean and dry land would be the edge of the beach. Or the ecotone between a woods and a tilled field is that spot where the woods are always encroaching on the field. At an ecotone, you have the most explosion of diversity, you have the most vigorous growth, you actually have the most productive growth. And I would contend that we also have an ecotone in time, not just in space. So that when you have a change or a disruption happening in the soil, then you have this increased vigor. And it's trying to change. So how do we use this? And I'm hoping that I can leave you with concepts, because obviously this is a different system, different climate, different soil than we have in the East. But I think the concepts are going to be pretty universal. But the change that every plant makes in the soil is profound. And I think we've learned to consider pests to be at random events. Oh, they're going to be all over. You know, bugs are all over. They kind of blew in. It had something to do with which way the wind blew. The weeds are all over. We just have to figure out which poison kills them the best. The diseases are all over. It just happens to be the freak of the weather or whatever that makes them attack. I've learned that that's not true. That every problem we have on our farms is the result of something to do with the environment, something to do with the soil. And everything we do on that soil has an impact on what that soil is going to be the best environment for. Another quote from Dr. Rademacher about weeds. He said, every crop should be planted after its most suitable predecessor, so that the enhanced vigor of the crop alone checks the weeds. So here is this concept from Dr. Rademacher, which I can see in the field. And that's whatever is the best adapted species in that field is going to have a biological advantage over the other ones. Doesn't mean there won't be other ones, but when everything is competition, if we could make our field always be the best, our crop always be the best suited species for the environment that's in the field we just planted, we're going to not only have an advantage over the weeds, but we're also going to have a better crop. So it's a win-win situation. Our crop yields go up, and our weed pressure goes down. Now I'm going to share a few observations with you that came over many years, and some of them really puzzled me. Excuse me. When we first started farming organically, there was a weed on our farm that I felt could prevent us from being successful, at least in row crops. We had velvet leaf. We also had lamb's quarter and pigweed, but the velvet leaf was the one that got taller than the corn. And it would get so big I couldn't pull it out of the ground. It had just tremendous roots. And I just learned different chemical combinations, and it seemed like over time, when we were farming conventionally, every new chemical that worked was short-term, and the stuff seemed to grow out of it, and pretty soon it was, a few of them were escaping, and pretty soon it was worse. And I rented a farm at this time from a neighbor had abandoned. And I remember him coming to me after he heard I rented the land that he had just walked away from. He said, let me tell you something about the old Vanderhoof place. Nothing grows on that land. Absolutely nothing but weeds will grow on that farm. That farm he lost a ton of money there. And I was renting it because had just switched to organic, and that land was certifiable because nobody had rented it in between because it was so poor. So I had to figure out, now, what do I do with this mess? I rented it cheap, got land when nobody else could get it. But the last guy lost his shirt here. So the first thing we did was thought about mismatching the life cycle of the pest in the crop. So this land had always had row crops. It wouldn't grow decent corn anymore, wouldn't grow soybeans. The weeds always took it over. And I reasoned, what about winter wheat? Well, winter wheat comes up at a time when these weeds don't bother it. So we planted winter wheat on it. And the weeds that bother winter wheat weren't there because that farm had been spent the last 20 years building up huge numbers of weeds that don't grow in winter crops. And the traditional practice that I learned from my parents that had been proven in Europe was that you always frost seed your winter wheat to red clover. Now, I know red clover grows in some areas out here, but other areas it might not be the best species. It might be sweet clover, it might be crimson clover. I'm sure NRCS could probably help you better there, matching what type of a legume would work. And what really blew me away was I'd never seen clover grow like that. When that wheat came off, the clover was on a tear. There was only about 6 inches of it sticking out of the clover when it was time to combine the wheat. Never before or since seen clover grow with such vigor. It must be the clover was the best adapted species. This land had been growing crops that weren't putting much nitrogen back. You know, the weeds were probably putting more carbon back than the crop was on this land. And nature was trying to balance itself. Now, we've spent a lot of time also in the last 20 years working closely with Cornell, wanting to know why. And Lori Drinkwater had been doing a lot of work on nitrogen fixation. She had several graduate students who had projects on our farm. And they showed that legumes work on a feedback loop. So that they're probably like people. You only work as hard as you have to. If you're put into dire straits, you're going to work like crazy. And if you're put into an easy situation, you're just going to not work quite as hard. Well, the legumes have this feedback loop with how much labile nitrogen is in the soil. How big are the nitrogen pools? How much nitrogen is readily available? Well, these soils had a nitrogen depression. Nitrogen was really, the crop had used up what little bit was there. And the clover just grew like crazy making up for it, fixing lots and lots of nitrogen. And that was quite an illustration for me. I don't have a lot of time, so I need to skip around. But on this farm, the velvet leaf, which had been really serious, there was 1 acre where the barnyard had been that I ended up mowing the corn because I didn't want the velvet leaf going to seed. It wouldn't be a crop there anyway. It was that bad. Just 1 acre. The rest of the farm made some crop. The next time I grew corn there 3 years later, it was only a little corner. The velvet leaf was actually progressively growing not quite as big. I wasn't noticing that. I was still just worried about the number of plants. By 2000, the velvet leaf was turning brown, was about this high, turning brown, then turning black, and then dying. And I had Tony DiTomaso came out from Cornell and he said, well, this is velvet leaf anthracnose. And I started rubbing my hands with greed thinking, wow, if I could take this disease and make a spray out of it, I could get rich. In fact, our friends, the Fransons, did keynote a few years later at the NOFA New York conference, and he took a bag full of those diseased velvet leaf plants back home with him, but actually his healthy velvet leaf. And he said the disease actually colonized, but Tony kind of threw cold water on me. He said, what I want to know is why this disease, which exists in all your neighbors' fields, but the crop gets it, the weed gets it and then shakes out of it, and it doesn't affect it very much. Why is it killing it in your field? Well, that was a pretty good question. It also kind of threw cold water on the idea of making any money off the idea. But a little later, Steve Vanek, who was doing graduate work on our farm, said there's more going on here than that. He said you've got Albutin yellows in the velvet leaf, which is a virus, which was stunning the growth of it. And then I noticed the velvet leaf, and this was in really hot, dry weather, was covered with whiteflies. Of course, the first thing when you see whiteflies and the kind of numbers I saw is panic, what's it doing to the crop? But you could look at that crop and there was the flies were not touching it. So we had what had been the bane of our farm, especially on that particular property, had gone from being this vigorous, overpowering weed to where it was getting attacked by insects, catching a virus, and then dying of a fungus. What happened? Well, originally that farm had been way over-fertilized with synthetic phosphorus. My best guess now is that it probably was not a very friendly environment for mycorrhizal fungi. At least not when I took it over. It had a lot of chemicals on it, had a lot of harsh fertilizers. And the non-mycorrhizal weeds were growing like gangbusters. All of these weeds that didn't need mycorrhizal associations had an advantage over the crops which are mycorrhizal. I noticed that these plants were so weak that you could pull them out of the ground with one hand midsummer. That had never happened before. So the system had changed. The velvet leaf, which was our best adapted species when I rented the land, was suddenly an unadapted species that was still there because of the enormous weed seed bank that we had. But it's gotten to the point where I don't even care if I see a velvet leaf. I don't even try to kill it because it will die anyway. So that was an example of a shift in the environment and a real profound effect it had on pests. Now, how big a jump is it to think these pests only attack sick velvet leaf? They won't touch healthy velvet leaf. What about pests attacking our crops? That might be a little bigger stretch. But I did find one field in about this time of corn where there was corn borer and it was flat on one side of a line and the other side was untouched, right down the middle of the field. We checked the crop history and there had been a field boundary change. One side of that line had been a hedgerow and the other side had been farmed differently. So different history in the soil. One side was attacked by corn borer, the other side was not touched. That was quite another kind of, was a wake-up call. The system that I was farming under, which is my assumptions, were not predicting the results that we were seeing in the field. Now when your observations challenge your assumptions, we've got two choices. We can either claim the observations are wrong, or we can wonder about the assumptions. And I see an awful lot of agriculture, especially in the early years. There's some big names. I know Dennis Avery's doesn't have much credibility anymore, but I used to see him as challenging the observations because he couldn't let go of his assumptions. And I like to point fingers, but I need to point the other four fingers back at me. We have to drop those assumptions that we're making when we start having observations that don't make sense. We fast forward again. When I was little, I was a real, probably pain in the butt would be the polite term for it, because whenever somebody was heading out to the field to plow, I always wanted to ride. And after we'd been organic a few years, something suddenly struck me. I was smelling something that was way back in my memory. As the plow broke the soil, there was a smell in the air. And I realized I haven't smelled this in years. And it's called geosin. I think, do you know the organism that makes it? Actiniomycetes, or it's one of the soil fungal organisms that makes that smell. And I didn't notice when it went away, because it went away a little bit at a time when we were farming conventionally. But I certainly noticed when it came back. And on one of my early inspections, my organic inspector, John Meyer, who's a good friend, would look at our transitional fields, and he wouldn't ask me which ones were transitional. He'd take a handful of dirt and stick his nose in it, and he told me which ones were organic and which ones were transitional. Now, I've retold that story to conventional farmers, and they tell me I'm full of prunes, but I've smelled that smell. So there was things going on. So how do we explain this? Obviously, that smell had something to do with the life in the soil. Obviously, which plants were growing better had something to do with the condition of the soil. You can't just single out one thing. There's a lot going on. Now I'm going to jump to something Bianca pointed out. That's every one of these plants that grows is putting out root exudates. And I would contend it's not just putting out root exudates randomly. That these plants are farming microbes around their roots, just like we farm crops to feed us in the soil. That makes sense? It seems that each species probably has its own group of other species that it's farming in the rhizosphere. I'm guessing that's one of the mechanisms by which these plants change the soil, because they're having a major impact on the biology in that soil. And it's those little species that they're doing things like gluing aggregates together to form stable aggregates. They're breaking down the organic matter to make fertility available. They're also doing some interesting things, and I'm going to throw a couple terms at you. One is SAR, which is systemic acquired resistance. ISR is induced systemic resistance, which are responses to attack by disease or attack by insects. Where they're showing now even that you could have one plant be attacked by an insect and it will have an impact on a plant 2 or 3 over, and that plant will launch a response. We're finding that there are organisms in the rhizosphere that, if they're present, can induce a resistance in that plant to diseases or bugs. That's part of the soil's ability to fight, to suppress disease. That's part of the health. And it's interesting that we talk about soil health and we talk about human health generally in terms of the absence of it. We don't become aware of it, and you really talk about it in the negative. So just like when we're sick, we notice certain symptoms. When the soil is sick, we notice symptoms. And a little bit of the history of the project at Cornell for soil health. Soil in New York, in western New York, is probably not what you would picture for New York. A lot of people picture New York as concrete. But western New York does have some agricultural soils, and they're great vegetable soils. And the farmers were having problems in the 70s. They were noticing their yields were dropping, and that no matter how much fertilizer they put on, or how many good pesticides they were using, they couldn't get the yields back up. And it was bad enough that it was threatening the industry. And they came to people like Georgia Bowie, who's now retired, with the question of, we need better pesticides. And George heard the question, but he interpreted it differently. He said, no, you don't need different pesticides. You need to understand why these plants are now succumbing to these pests and why your pesticides aren't working. And George did some really groundbreaking work that I think he probably stimulated the soil health testing. And he did a brilliant test, which was part of the original soil health testing series, which was disease suppressiveness, and it was in dry beans. The species is phaseolus. So kidney beans, black turtle soups, all of those beans that the Native Americans grew. And they were native to New York. And in the 40s and 50s, farmers could make a mortgage payment sometimes on 5 acres of dry beans. They were just a really profitable crop. Until the embargo with Cuba in 1960, they were still the workhorse on every farm to make payments and to bring in extra income. Well, snap beans are the same species. And we were finding that these plants that had formerly had roots that could go 2 to 3 feet in the ground were getting Pythium, Rhizoctonia, Fusarium, and the roots would rot right off at the ground. The yields were dropping, they were dropping rapidly. And we had the same thing happening on our organic farm. Organic's not immune from these problems, it's management. The first year we grew dry beans, I thought I'd found the way to print money. They were the nicest beans in the neighborhood because other people had been growing them longer and our farm hadn't had them in years. So we had a fairly clean soil. And I learned you wait 5 years minimum. 5 years later I planted dry beans. I was using a lot of legumes in the rotation. The dry beans came up, they didn't grow quite as good. The next time, the third time in the cycle, those beans came up and I figured this variety must be garbage. They've changed variety on me or something. The roots have rotted up. Now this was with long rotation. And we had George come to one of our organic farmer meetings, and he explained that we may have been rotating to 5 other crops for 5 years, but we weren't rotating at all as far as the biology of that soil was concerned. The same pathogens that attacked the dry beans were also attacking our cover crops. We're also attacking our other crops, although they didn't always affect them. You didn't always see it. And with his bioassay, this early test, he would take a sample of soil from the field and he would plant a highly susceptible variety in the greenhouse in it. And then he created conditions that caused disease. And he would do an analysis of the roots, and he gave you a 1 to 5 number initially as to what is your disease pressure going to be in that field. And it turned out to be very accurate. But he didn't stop there. he asked, what effect will the crop that precedes the crop you're growing have on this disease? And what he found was that there were some crops were co-hosts to the disease. They didn't show symptoms, but they actually increased or maintained disease pressure. Some crops gave a small reduction in the disease pressure. There were other crops that were also susceptible, so that you could see it there. And he made it kind of a gradient. He said, this group of crops will make your disease pressure worse. So even though I'd been rotating 5 years away, I was rotating with mostly crops that made the problem worse. When I came back to beans, it was as if I'd been growing beans every year, biologically. But he found that there were a group of crops that would reduce the pressure, and then there were just a few that would literally destroy the pathogens. One of them was yellow mustard. Another one was buckwheat. Yellow mustard gives off gas when it's turned under, and that gas fumigates the soil and kills the fungal pathogens. And another factor that I wasn't looking at was nematodes. We were getting nematode buildup in the soil, and the nematodes were abrading the bean roots, which were making the fungus worse, so that they were really suffering more from the disease than they should have. But George said, why don't you introduce some different crops in your rotation and back off on the red clover? And my first reaction was, no, the red clover is what makes our nitrogen. But and looking at those beans, I think I had to listen to George. And he said, but don't do it on the whole field. I want you to leave part of it. He was making me prove to myself that he was right. So we did this. We planted the yellow mustard no-till. We just broadcast it in March. Yellow mustard can tolerate a frost down into the low 20s. It can actually tolerate colder right after you throw it on. So we were going there in early March, broadcasting yellow mustard on our cornfields. It wasn't a great stand, but it grew. It came in full bloom. We did everything else the same, but we had introduced one more species into our farm. And you could see right to the row where we stopped using the yellow mustard. And George dug the plants up, had his graduate students with him, and it was a full, on a 1 to 5 scale, the roots were one whole scale better where we had the mustard turned under. And I really thank him for telling me, don't do the whole field. Don't just do what I tell you. Do enough of it to see if I'm right. With that success, we tried buckwheat. Buckwheat is a totally different mode of action. Buckwheat will give off an enzyme. It's got an organism in its rhizosphere that gives off an enzyme called chitinase, which destroys cell walls. So the buckwheat is farming these microbes around its roots that are out there marauding through the field looking for pathogens and attacking them. That's kind of a nice trick for a crop. The buckwheat, we found out, has all kinds of impacts. Buckwheat can break the bond of iron phosphate. And I remember still being in college, and we had a professor who was having fun with us. He had us learn to test for phosphorus, and he gave us one sample. And everybody was there trying to redo their experiment because we all thought we'd screwed up. And he found a sample that tested 0 for phosphorus. That was driving everyone crazy. And he finally told us what he'd done. He said, now, what do you do with a field like this? And of course, everyone said, put on phosphorus fertilizer. He said, wrong. It's still not going to grow very good in this field. But he said, plant buckwheat. Buckwheat will get all the phosphorus it wants. It'll get a surplus, and it'll leave your soil higher in phosphorus when you turn it under. So there's another byproduct of it. The old farmers in our neighborhood all told me, if you have quackgrass, plant a crop of buckwheat, and it'll be gone. So obviously the buckwheat, it might not be allelopathy, and I think we've lumped off as allelopathy a lot of things that might not be. I believe what the buckwheat was probably doing, probably had another organism or somehow itself was biologically attacking quackgrass roots to clean the field up. You know, a lot of this is old farmer lore, and that takes us full circle back to the things my grandmother used to tell me about Rudolf Steiner. And Steiner's teacher, and how am I doing on time? I'm digressing. Okay, Steiner's teacher and inspiration was actually Goethe, the playwright, which isn't that significant in itself. But what Goethe's big criticism was on modern agriculture, and he wrote on modern agriculture. He said that, and this was in the 1800s. He said the scientific method is changing one variable and measuring one result out of an almost infinite number of possible results. He said this research is going to not give you full results because you're ignoring most of the outcomes of every experiment you're doing. That was an interesting philosophy. And I think that was Rudolf Steiner's big contribution. You know, and on top of being extremely dense reading. You know, you've all heard this expression, sleeping on rocks, trying to read Steiner at night. But he made a lot of observations, and biodynamic farmers have made a lot of observations about color. So that if you see yellow flowered weeds, it's an indication of sulfur. If you see blue or purple flowered weeds, it indicates, think about phosphorus. If you see white blossoms, think about potassium. Now, this is something I've heard from biodynamic farmers. When we have land in New York it's considered poor soil, it gets hayed every year, they keep removing minerals. The second cutting is Queen Anne's lace and chicory. These fields have been destitute, they've been robbed of their phosphorus and potash, and those are the weeds that grow. You know, that's when you see the mustard growing, and I've seen this quite often, there's a sulfur deficiency in the soil. You know, I don't know why. These are kind of observations that were made by generations of farmers. But I think what these observations point to is that farmers have observed and passed down connections that they didn't know the scientific basis for. That doesn't mean the connections weren't right. It just means they didn't know why. But it also means they can use those observations. So that takes me to my next evolution in understanding is that learning to understand what is our soil telling us. And I think our soil can teach us a tremendous amount about soil health if we just observe what's growing there. So for instance, we started having a tremendous amount of mustard growing on our farm about the time we had this disease problem hit in the beans. And about the same time we were getting a sulfur deficiency that was showing up on our soil tests. We introduced one more species, yellow mustard. We also tried to bring in brassica species, things like cabbage. Our farm up until then had not had enough diversity. We were growing corn, soybeans, and a winter grain with a clover cover crop. Sounded like a real diverse rotation. It was not diverse enough. We could look for a pesticide, or we could look for adding another kind of diversity that would change the environment to handle that pest. So that was a choice. We were actually asking the wrong question for most of the time I farmed. I kept asking when I saw something that I didn't like, how do I kill it, instead of asking, what is it telling me, or why is it here? Or what can I do different that'll make it not be that dominant? So the mustard was one species that we brought in. Another problem that we ran into, and Cornell bore this out. Cornell has a systems trial that's having trouble getting funding right now. And I really would like to make an appeal to our leaders that we support these long-term agricultural systems trials. They're not sexy. Funders don't like to pay for this long-term work. But where else can you get comparisons that are valid? To look at systems that have been managed in a way long enough to become stable. If you want to see what is the result of a system, you have to have a place where you can see it. You have to have a place where it actually exists. And we don't have money to keep them going. But Cornell's is still going. But in that trial, they copied our rotation, which was also the rotation of most of the farms in our area. This three crops, one cover crop. And the winter grain was always following the soybeans. So the soil, it's a pretty good rotation. Your soil's covered 2 years out of 3 year-round with that rotation. but it wasn't diverse enough. About in the second and third cycle of this rotation, we started seeing perennial weeds, things like sow thistle, Canada thistle, bindweed, started moving into these crops. That was a problem. And I could see this was not as sustainable. Even though it was a good, very profitable cropping system, we suddenly had to spend a lot more effort controlling weeds as the system changed with these perennials. And at Cornell, the same problem happened at exactly the same point. They were using the same soil, same management system, and I think that was a tremendous affirmation of the observation. But the good thing is at Cornell, this was being documented in a very disciplined way in a research setting. That was one of those multiple outcomes that if we hadn't been measuring all these different outcomes, we would have missed. You know, it was really important to measure and record all these things. Now, on our farm, when this became a problem, some fields it was worse than others, obviously. We tried the old disrupting the life cycle method again, because that had worked so well for us in the past. And we found that winter barley is harvested before the Canada thistle or the sow thistle goes far enough through its life cycle to replenish its roots. So we went from the winter wheat or winter spell to another winter grain, winter barley. It's planted earlier, it's harvested much earlier, and then the winter barley was harvested early enough that we could double crop. So we did a deep till. Here's one of your other soil health measures. The perennial weeds were responding to soil compaction, the inability of the subsoil getting oxygen. So we used the subsoiler, but we also no-tilled buckwheat into that stubble. That gave us another way to deal with the diseases that were in the beans. And I remember we instituted the same change in the Cornell Systems trial, and our weed ecologist was listening to the discussion. He said, in one cycle, you are never going to get enough competition to smother out these perennials. And I remember the report at the end of that cycle was, well, we can go back to our old rotation now. We don't have those weeds anymore. 1 year. There was something happened biologically in that soil that just devastated those perennial weeds. Now, I would think it has something to do with we were changing the soil health, we were changing the environment. We changed it profoundly enough and fast enough to take away the conditions needed for growth in those species. I think we've got all kinds of opportunities to learn that. These are just specific examples, but everybody in their own farm can see things. One of my guesses is that if you have a lot of foxtail, and I remember even telling, I had a picture once that I showed at a talk way back when I was really early and naive in my learning about organic, where I ran out of gypsum, and it looked just like the sprayer ran out of spray, and all of a sudden there was foxtail where I'd run out of gypsum. My conclusion was the gypsum was killing the foxtail. It wasn't. Afterwards, we've had lots of times when we put gypsum on, it didn't kill the foxtail. But what I do see is where the soil is so compacted that it doesn't have good gas exchange. Foxtail seems to grow, seems to dominate. So to me, foxtail is telling me this soil is not able to breathe. It's too tight. Another measure of soil health. But where foxtail grows well, I would give you pretty good odds that millet would grow well. And also the foxtail will help fix that tight soil. And I'm pretty sure millet will help biologically break up that tight soil. You see where this is going? We've got tools in the toolbox of tillage, of methods, of practices, but we've got a whole other set of tools potentially that we could be adding to it. They're biological tools. You know, every one of these plants, every one of these crops, and I'm avoiding dealing with it as crop and cover crop. The soil doesn't know whether it was planted as a crop or as a cover crop. It just knows something's growing there. You know, and another side observation is land is awfully expensive. Why are we paying all that money for it and using it for 3 to 4 months of the year and not doing anything with it the rest of the year? You know, this land ought to be working for us all year round. And I've done a lot of work with relay cropping, partly because I'm a tightwad, which to me is the relay cropping is really the best no-till. Or if we planted our soybeans really late, we often had years when the weather didn't allow us to plant when we wanted to, and I realized we can't get our spelt planted on time. We would just no-till them. We would broadcast them into the beans standing at yellow leaf when we saw the first yellow leaves. And I've repeatedly had crops that looked lousy and yielded just as good as if I planted and done, actually they yielded better than if I'd used tillage because they were planted at the right time instead of being planted way too late. And then we would still relay that with clover. So we've gone as long as 3 years with no tillage, just planting a succession of crops. And I think the trick here is the succession, that these crops were biologically compatible, that clover somehow gets a good start by being in the spelt or in the wheat. But the spelt was getting a good start by being in the soybeans while they were still alive. Now I've got a research question here. How much of this is because we had a living root system in the soil when the new crop started? You know, is there some kind of a handoff of mycorrhizal or of other microbes that are in the soil where this living root system helps the next crop get started? Because I've tried it later and it just doesn't do well. It might work if you have the rain coming at the right time, or it might work if you get lucky. But it seems if we hit that window just right, we were able to get it to catch. And my philosophy on tillage is that it's a tool that has to be used right. And it's also an expense. It's a very expensive thing to do, both biologically and dollars and cents. If we're going to spend money on any input, don't we want to know for sure that it's going to pay us back and how it's going to pay us back before we decide to do it? And there's a term I love to use in relation to tillage, and it's been common in our neighborhood, people who love to do recreational tillage. If you ask this question of why are you doing it, and if you can't show any real benefit from it, then obviously they're only doing it for recreation. And I've done recreational tillage in my day. It's an awfully expensive pastime. On the other hand, if tillage would have helped, and we don't do it, then we're missing an opportunity to improve our profits. You know, either side can be true. We've seen soils in New York that I've consulted on, and again, these are from the really poor part of the state that have been made, they've been cut for hay for 50 years. Very little manure put back. Those soils will test as high as 6-7% organic matter. They've got brambles growing in them. The cows don't like to eat the hay that grows there. They're lousy yielders. And yet, in terms of organic matter, they're in excellent health. To me, those soils are much like a millionaire who's starving to death because he won't take any money out of the bank. That organic matter is not cycling. It's not performing its service. It's just there. I mean, we could be burying coal or burying fence posts in that soil and having maybe more effect in terms of carbon. So I think we need to treat the organic matter like a bank account where you have to invest something to get a return, but you want to be sure that you take less out than what you put back in every year. You also want to have it invested where it's going to give you the best kind of a return. You know, these are all pitfalls, and I think it's a good analogy. So that if we are turning in a crop of medium red clover ahead of corn, that medium red clover is going to supply all the nitrogen the corn needs, and we tend to just think about nitrogen. I've done the analysis on the red clover, a very heavy cover crop of red clover. We could be turning down 400 pounds of N, just in the tops, not the roots. About 40 pounds of P2O5, and another 120 pounds of K2O. None of this shows in your soil test. This is all biologically active, rapidly cycling, available to the crop material, if it breaks down at the right time. If it breaks down at the wrong time, the weeds are going to use it. If we mismatch the need, the mineralization of our fertility with the needs for the crop, we're not going to get the benefit from the crop, but we are going to have the opportunistic species in there, the weeds, taking advantage of it. And I see this with fall plowing. If we fall plow down a legume crop, at least in the east, we're creating a weed mess and we're polluting the water. That could be on an organic farm as much as on a conventional farm. Plus, we're making erosion from the improved runoff, or the increased runoff, no protection on top of the soil. But we're starting the mineralization of the fertility that's in that organic matter we're turning down, so that it's going to coincide with nothing there growing in the field. Now, when that happens, and you get a big rain, we're losing fertilizer. And we're adding to the eutrophication of the water. Again, organic farmers can do this as easily as conventional farmers. We have to realize what we're doing. What we found is when we turn the clover down at the right stage so that it mineralizes when it's going to have the highest demand, then we get a side benefit. I think we're making a burst of CO2. And if the corn canopy is like this, the corn is actually using more CO2 than what's in the air. And if that organic matter breakdown comes at that point, it'll stimulate the corn. But we're also fixing a lot more carbon. Some of that's going right back through into the sugars of the plant, which then it's not just the stover and not just the grain, but it's the root exudates that are getting that carbon. We did a SARE grant about 15 years ago now, where we tested soil every 6 weeks. And I expected to find my organic matter dropping after tillage. Obviously, the theory is tillage speeds up breakdown. Your organic matter should drop, and we were watching it. And surprisingly, it went up by 1 whole percent from May until August. I don't know why it went up. And we were replicated. We were on many different plots. And I did it another year to see if it would repeat. My guess is this was the root exudates that were supplying that carbon. I don't know for sure what was happening, but again, this is seeing observations that contradict our assumptions. We really need to be sure and disciplined that we don't just come to the first conclusion. And I think if I'm going to criticize us as organic farmers, we're too quick to make an observation or figure out that this thing works or that thing works, and then come up with a pseudoscientific explanation that may or may not be true. And probably more often than not is off the wall and gets people to laugh at us. I've seen a few of those just in the last 2 years that I've learned some science behind why they were made. Has anyone here ever heard that fish, liquid fish emulsion, or nitrate nitrogen will make plants grow more vegetative growth? Anyone here read Acres? Well, I've got a book, an agronomy manual written from Germany that said that nitrate nitrogen is the precursor for plants to make cytokinins. Cytokinins induce vegetative growth in plants. And the reference was that if you have wheat at green up and there's a deficiency of nitrate nitrogen, you're going to lose yield because you need cytokinins to induce tillering. The tillering gives you more yield potential. And I've seen for years if I put fish on my dry beans, it would delay bloom. Or if I put fish on peppers, they might not bloom. They might just make big plants. The same lore said that if you use kelp or ammonia nitrogen, that it can induce blooming. And I've seen that in dry beans, that if I put kelp on the dry beans early, they'll bloom almost within a few days, and they'll be too small. Well, the same book talked about the ammonia nitrogen induces formation of gibberellins, which are plant hormones that are involved in getting ripe. So we've had all kinds of stories over the years about that the fish gives a moon energy, or that the kelp gives more of an earth energy. But this science from Europe actually explains the observation, and that when we're using fish, we're getting more NO3 nitrogen in the plant. Kelp tends to induce the opposite. These are tools we can use. But I think we've done ourselves a disservice by making guesses and passing them off in the place of science. So that's just kind of a little self-criticism. Just like I was known to say when we would put gypsum on, we got rid of our foxtail. I think it was a much more complicated picture. The gypsum in that case probably helped loosen the soil, helped it breathe better, was part of a process, but we were not identifying correctly what was happening. And it wasn't, I need to be very careful to identify when I'm making guesses. That's why I like to label these things as good guesses. But there are also challenges for researchers to go, let's figure out if this is true or figure out why. One other thing that came out of the Cornell trials, and I think I'll have to leave room for questions, is we noticed, and this was on a trial done on our farm, we wanted to know how much compost to use or how much manure to use in an organic system. And we did yield calibration responses. And we took a conventional recommendation of N, P, and K, and then we used 2 sources of composted manure, but it was mostly manure. You know, it wasn't what NLP compost would have been qualified as NLP compost. And we found that actually the old 1950s yield calibration data worked with organic inputs. It was accurate. But what we also saw was that at 6 times the rate, because we went from 0 to all the way to 6 times the recommended fertilizer, there was a phenomenal increase in both the number and the growth of weeds in those plots. And it was one that we could see years later. We GPSed this experiment. We did it in a 20-acre field, GPSed all the treatments. It was a random block. And you could climb up on the grain bin and look out over the field and see those high fertility plots for a long time afterwards. Chuck Moeller and Thomas Bjorkman did a fair amount of research on this. Thomas, first of all, worked with me on the yield calibrations, and he did 2 charts. He showed the yield would hit 100% on the crop, would hit 100% at a certain point, and then he calibrated the weed yield. And he showed that we never found out how much manure would have been the top yield of weeds. It was still going up rapidly. And we were already at 6 times the rate of fertilizer that was giving us our top crop yield, which to me has major implications for what's going on in the Delmarva, where manure is the cheapest source of nitrogen. It's being used as a nitrogen source, and farmers are putting on 6 to 8 times as much phosphorus year after year after year as research is showing they're getting their top yield at. That phosphorus is ending up in the water and causing eutrophication and doing all kinds of damage. You know, there's no excuse to be doing that kind of management. And I'll make my last jump in digression here, is if you look at ecosystems around the world, what is the most productive one? Which ecosystem has the most diversity and the highest production fixing of carbon?
Tropical rainforest?
I would think it was a tropical rainforest. The tropical rainforest has the lowest testing soil, the poorest soil of any system. As an observation, I think we can learn again from nature. The reason it has that low test is if it was soluble fertilizer in the form that we test for, with the amount of rain they get, it wouldn't be there anymore anyway. So the tropical rainforest is very productive and yet very low in fertility from a chemical standpoint. What's happening? Well, that fertility is in a biological form, just like this cover crop that I've just described. Very available, very good for plant growth, but not subject to being lost. We need to make our farms more like the rainforest, where we've got a very high level of mobile fertility. We need to manage that fertility to only become soluble when the crop is going to use it, and keep it on the land. And I think that's, this is just a set of examples of places where we can make observations and use them. And I'm hoping I'm leaving you with principles that then you can take home and expand on and make fit to your system, in your own land. Question?
What is the timing with the clover to your corn?
Okay. The question is, what is the timing where the clover matches the corn? Now, it's a little different going north and south, but we're finding in New York that if we plow and then plant within a week, we're fairly well matched. And I know they're further south, we've got different temperatures, we've got different soil environments. I think we need to learn these locally, you know, and use some trial and error and some observation. I found where if we have clover and let it go an extra year, now incidentally, this clover is only going from the time the grain is harvested in July until the next spring. It's producing all this nitrogen in that short time. I have let the clover go 1 year for hay and had it run out and actually die. And I always had weeds when I did that, because that nitrogen was mineralizing the year before when the clover died. And by the time I grew my crop, it was the same, almost the same as if I'd fall plowed. If I had probably a mixture there, if I had a mixture there, grass or you know, or something else to take up that nitrogen, it probably would have been much better. You know, this all has to do with that handing off. But I think in general, if you plow a crop, plow the land or till in some way, and then plant very quickly, it'll time well. I know in Jeff's no-till system, with the hairy vetch, there's enough nitrogen in the soil and enough being cycled out of the vetch to match the corn needs, just being on top. You know, these are all site-specific examples, but I think we can use our observations and our tests, you know, to predict it fairly well. We have had some, Cornell has done PSNT tests and some nitrogen availability tests, and I've had the Haney test done on our land. And in general, our yields top out at a much lower level of nitrogen and a much lower level of fertility on those tests than where their tests predict they will, which I think just tells me that our biology is, you know, when we're taking the test, our biology is making the minerals mineralize much faster afterwards to be there in time for the crop.